Welcome to Kamloops Alliance Church's 14 Days of Prayer. My name's Diane. One of the buzz phrases we're throwing around these days is social distancing. Unheard of by my non-science types like myself just a few weeks ago, I'm now very aware of my face-to-face disconnection from other humans. The good news is, though we must be separate from one another, there's no social distancing from God. He reminds us in Hebrews 13 that He will not abandon us. Studies in neuroscience show us that we're wired for connectivity. Imaging shows how the brain lights up with connections when a mother is nursing her baby. There are specific brain firings when people hug each other, and the most profound firings happen at around the 20-second mark. So, how do we consider our connectivity to God? One of the characteristics of God is His omnipresence. Psalm 139, verses 7 to 10 talk about God's presence like this. I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. If I ride the wings of the morning, if I dwell by the farthest oceans, even there your hand will guide me, and your strength will support me. He was present when you woke up this morning. God was present while you were eating breakfast. He was present in the conversations you had throughout the day. But you might not have been aware of it. We can go through a whole day without any thought toward God. This cognitive understanding of God's omnipresence is helpful intellectually, but I have to confess it doesn't feel very comforting in my greedy, lonely heart. So, if God is omnipresent, how do I cultivate a continual sense of the presence of God? At times I've wanted this sense of God's presence so much I've tried to manufacture it, pretending I felt something even though I didn't. God was gracious not to mock my attempts at feeling closer to Him. Instead, He has brought people and tools into my life that help me cultivate His presence until it has become very real. How do we cultivate the practice of the presence of God? How do we dwell in the radical proximity of God in our living rooms and on our patios or in our prayer closets? In the scope and sequence of sermon planning, early in 2020, Pastor Chris led our congregation for several weeks through a teaching series on the practices of the Christian faith. And less than a month later, we find ourselves living with the realities of COVID-19 and unprecedented opportunity to live out radical simplicity, radical solitude, and some of the other quiet and internal practices. In this temporary, simple lifestyle, let's leverage this time to build a practice of refuge, to practice the presence of God in the place of refuges we have lost to social distancing. Practicing the presence of God is a phrase coined by Brother Lawrence, a man who joined a religious order in 17th century France. Over his lifetime of simplicity in a monastery, he came to understand prayer and a spiritual life entirely different than our 21st century understanding of growth. He often used his holy imagination to allow his mind to wander what it would be like in the presence of God, such as being a poor criminal at the feet of a judge. At other times, he would imagine himself as a tender father holding him close to his heart. Brother Lawrence said, "At all times, every hour, every minute, even at my busiest times, I drove away my mind everything that was capable of interrupting my thought of God." Here we are, 5 centuries later, in the midst of pandemic living and social distancing, and we too can be intimately connected to God. But we're leaky. We forget to remember to dwell in His presence. If we're spending our time dwelling on press conferences and memes and travel announcements and hand sanitizer racketeering, we're missing opportunities for our most meaningful, powerful connections with God our Father, Jesus our friend, and His comforting Spirit who lives within us. Sometimes Christians get a little weirded out when they consider using their imaginations for holy purposes. And yet these are the very same imaginations God created us with to use for making music and poetry and growing food. God will make His presence known to us using the very imaginations He equipped us with. I want to introduce you to a part of a prayer called the breastplate prayer. This prayer is attributed to St. Patrick. Regardless of its origins, it can lead us into a beautiful time with God and practicing His presence. This is only one excerpt of the prayer. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ where I lie, Christ where I sit, Christ where I arise, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks to me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. Salvation is of the Lord, salvation is of the Christ. May your salvation, Lord, be ever with us. After our video today, I encourage you to sit quietly for a few minutes. You'll find downloadable prompts on the website next to this video link. Take each phrase of that prayer and imagine in your mind's eye the very picture of the prayer. What would it look like if Christ was with you? Where would you be? What would you be doing? Walking on a beach? Sitting in a team meeting? Watching a movie together? Conversing in a coffee shop? How do you feel having Christ with you? Move on to the next picture in your mind. Christ before you. He's walking out in front. You are in His wake. He's deflecting a harsh word, holding up a sword to ward off an enemy. The driving storm hits Him first and you're protected by being behind Him. What else happens or doesn't happen when Christ is before you? Move on to Christ behind you. He's bringing up the rear. He's got your back. How confidently can you walk into that difficult conversation knowing He's got your back? How bold can you be if Christ is behind you? Who might He be protecting you from when He's at your back? Does He lean forward and whisper wisdom or comfort or affirmation into your ear? Does He put His hand quietly on your shoulder to remind you He is there? Spend as much time in this exercise as you want. Do it more than once. Journal your experiences. Sit in solitude and enjoy the presence of Christ. I pray it deepens your connection with God your Father, Jesus your friend, and the Spirit your comforter. And may this practicing the presence of God dispel your sense of isolation in these unprecedented times.